Carmilla by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. This book is part of Project Gutenberg and is available at gutenberg.org, as this book is under public domain. Prologue. Oh wait, before we do that, when was this written? It doesn't say. Or at that time, it's fine, she'll be done drinking here in a moment. Carmilla was written in 1872. You hungry? You thirsty, baby girl? Thirsty little pants? My weasel, she's in the background. Eventually I'll have a setup that will be a little bit more conducive to doing this. Prologue. Upon a paper attached to the narrative which follows, Dr. Hesselius has written a rather elaborate note, which he accompanies with a reference to his essay on this strange subject which the MS illuminates. This mysterious subject he treats, in that essay, with his usual learning and acumen, and with remarkable directness and condensation. It will form but one volume of the series of that extraordinary man's collected papers. As I publish the case in this volume, simply to interest the laity, I shall forestall the intelligent lady who relates it in nothing. And after due consideration, I have determined, therefore, to abstain from presenting any precis of the learned doctor's reasoning, or extract from his statement on a subject which he describes as involving, not improbably, some of the profoundest arcana of our dual existence and its intermediates. I was anxious on discovering this paper to reopen the correspondence commenced by Dr. Hesselius so many years before, with a person so clever and careful I was anxious on discovering this paper to reopen the correspondence commenced by Dr. Hesselius so many years before, with a person so clever and careful as his informant seems to have been. Much to my regret, however, I found that she had died in the interval. She, probably, could have added little to the narrative, which she communicates in the following pages, with, so far as I can pronounce, such conscientious particularity. And this is not for my demo reel, this is just for narrating, for posting in places, and to read y'all a book. Chapter 1. An Early Fright. Chapter 1. An Early Fright. In Styria, we, though by no means magnificent people, inhabit a castle or schloss. A small income in that part of the world goes a great way. 800 or 900 a year does wonders. Scantily enough, ours would have answered among wealthy people at home. Scantily enough, ours would have answered among wealthy people at home. My father is English, and I bear an English name, although I never saw England. But here in this lonely and primitive place, where everything is so marvelously cheap, I really don't see how ever so much more money would at all materially add to our comforts or even luxuries. My father was in the Austrian service, and retired upon a pension and his patrimony, and purchased this feudal residence, and the small estate on which it stands, a bargain. Nothing can be more picturesque or solitary. It stands on a slight eminence in a forest. The road, very old and narrow, passes in front of its drawbridge, never raised in my time, and its moat stocked with perch, and sailed over by many swans, and floating on its surface white fleets of water lilies. Over all this, the Schloss shows its many-windowed front, its towers, and its Gothic chapel. The forest opens in an irregular. The forest opens in irregular. The forest opens in an irregular and very picturesque glade before its gate, and at the right, a steep Gothic bridge carries over a stream that winds in deep shadow through the wood. I have said that this is a very lonely place. Judge whether I say truth. Looking from the hall door towards the road, the forest in which our castle stands extends 15 miles to the right and 12 to the left. The nearest inhabited village is about 7 of your English miles to the left. The nearest inhabited schloss of any historic associations is that of old General Spielsdorf, nearly 20 miles away to the right. I have said the nearest inhabited village because there is only 3 miles westward, that is to say, in the direction of General Spielsdorf's Schloss, a ruined village with its quaint little church, now roofless, in the aisle of which are the moldering tombs of the proud family of Karnstein, now extinct, who once owned the equally desolate chateau which, in the thick of the forest, now overlooks the silent ruins of the town. Respecting the cause of the desertion of this striking and melancholy spot, there is a legend which I shall relate to you another time. I must tell you now how very small is the party who constitute the inhabitants of our castle. I don't include servants, or those dependents who occupy rooms in the buildings attached to the Schloss. Listen and wonder. My father, who was the kindest man on earth, but growing old, and I, at the date of my story, only 19. 8 years have passed since then. I and my father constituted the family at the Schloss. My mother, a Styrian lady, died in my infancy, but I had a good-natured governess who had been with me from, I might almost say, my infancy. I could not remember the time when her fat, benignant face was not a familiar picture in my memory. This was Madame Perrodon, a native of Bern, whose care and good nature now in part supplied me the whose care and good nature now in part supplied to me the loss of my mother, whom I do not even remember, so early I lost her. She made a third at our little dinner party. There was a fourth, Mademoiselle de La Fontaine, a lady, such as you term, I believe, a finishing governess. She spoke French and German, Madame Perrodon French and broken English, to which my father and I added English, which, partly to prevent it becoming a lost language among us, and partly from patriotic motives, we spoke every day. The consequence was a babel, at which strangers used to laugh, and which I shall make no attempt to reproduce in this narrative, and which I shall make no attempt to reproduce in this narrative. And there were 2 or 3 young lady friends besides, pretty nearly of my own age, who were occasional visitors, for longer or shorter terms, and these visits I sometimes returned. These were our regular social resources. But of course there were chance visits from neighbors, of only 5 or 6 leagues distance. My life was, notwithstanding, rather a solitary one, I can assure you. My gouvernante had just so much control over me, as you might conjecture, which sage pers- My gouvernante had just so much control over me, as you might conjecture, such sage persons would have in the case of a rather spoiled girl, whose only parents allowed her pretty nearly her own way in everything. The first occurrence in my existence